Hello, my name is Douglas Bloch. I'm an author and mental health educator. Welcome to your Depression Recovery channel, where each week we talk about practical tools and coping strategies for healing from depression and anxiety. This is episode 11 of my audiobook, When Going Through Hell, Don't Stop. And this week you'll be hearing Chapter 6, Overcoming the Stigma of Depression, in which I talk about my struggle to overcome the stigma of mental illness that says a person with depression is weak-willed or has a defect in character. It's not true, but that's what a lot of people believe.
Chapter 6, Overcoming the Stigma of Depression. The last great stigma of the 20th century is the stigma of mental illness. Tipper Gore. In the school of life, the best students get the hardest problems. Anonymous. Up until this point, I've been describing the pain of depression as I experienced it on a physiological and emotional level. There existed a second level of distress that, though less primal, was nonetheless debilitating in its own way. This was the guilt and shame I felt about being depressed. Despite the fact that celebrities such as reporter Mike Wallace, author William Styron, actress Patty Duke, the vice president's wife Tipper Gore, and founder of CNN Ted Turner had publicly shared their battles with depression and manic depression, the stigma of mental illness remained. After my first hospitalization, I remember the dilemma I faced in trying to explain my 3-day absence to my employer. If I told the truth, that I had been hospitalized for anxiety and depression, I stood a chance of losing my job. Instead, I reported that I had been treated for insomnia at a sleep clinic. Clinical depression is a medical condition, similar to diabetes or heart disease, my psychiatrist responded when I confessed how I had concealed my hospitalization. We need to stop making depression a moral issue. Is the person with a disorder of the pancreas or the circulatory system weak-willed, lazy, or defective? Of course not. And neither is an individual with a disorder of the brain. Unfortunately, a recent survey conducted by the National Mental Health Association revealed that 43% of Americans still believe that depression is the result of a weak will or a deficit in one's character. Many doctors also subscribe to the defect in character theory. Consider the observations of physician A. John Rush. Doctors are still reluctant to make the diagnosis of depression because they too feel like, oh, you must have done something wrong. How did you get yourself into this pickle? Which sort of means the patient is to blame. It's okay if you have a neurological disease, Parkinson's, Huntington's, urinary incontinence, a busted spine because you got into an auto accident. But once you move up to the higher cortical areas, now you don't have a disease anymore. Now you have trouble coping. Now you have a bad attitude. Hopefully, with the discovery that depression and other forms of mental illness have a biological component, people will no longer think that these disorders are caused by personal inadequacies or lack of willpower. I believe that at least part of the stigma surrounding mental illness arises from living in a culture where feelings of vulnerability are considered weak and unacceptable. This is especially true for men who are raised with the injunction that big boys don't cry, i.e., it is not okay for men to be vulnerable and show their feelings. For example, the observant reader will note that thus far, my entire support system has consisted of women. A good male friend who avoided me during my illness later confided, "When you were depressed, I was afraid to be around you, for fear that I might catch your depression." What he meant was that being in my presence might cause him to tap into his own latent depression, a proposition that was so uncomfortable he had to split. When I meet people who have spent their lives battling psychiatric illnesses, I do not see wimps. Instead, I see strong and courageous individuals who have the Herculean task of bearing and transforming intense pain. Like St. George who slew the dragon, their task is to conquer their inner demons. I'm reminded of what Christopher Reeve said about this kind of heroism shortly after he became paralyzed. When the first Superman movies came out, I was frequently asked, "What is a hero?" My answer was that a hero is someone who commits a courageous action without considering the consequences. A soldier who crawls out of a foxhole to drag an injured buddy to safety. I also meant people who were slightly larger than life. Houdini and Lindenborough, John Wayne, JFK, and Joe DiMaggio. Now my answer is completely different. I think of a hero as an ordinary individual who finds the strength to persevere and endure in spite of overwhelming obstacles. One such hero was President Abraham Lincoln, who achieved greatness in spite of the fact that he experienced bleak, despairing periods of depression throughout his life, probably brought on by the early death of his mother and cold treatment at the hands of his father. A typical depressive episode is described by the psychiatrist Karl Menninger in his book, The Vital Balance. On his wedding day, all preparations were in order and the guests assembled. But Lincoln didn't appear. He was found in his room in deep dejection, obsessed with ideas of unworthiness, hopelessness, and guilt. Prior to his illness, Lincoln was an honest but undistinguished lawyer, whose failures were more conspicuous than his successes. This was when he was considered well, before his mental illness made its appearance. What he became and achieved after his illness is part of our great national heritage. In today's political climate, where image, style, and sound bites are more important than substance, one wonders if someone like Lincoln or other introverted American presidents such as Thomas Jefferson could be elected. Clearly, it is time to reassess our evaluation of what makes a leader. The challenge of being a nobody. For many people, the stigma of being depressed is compounded by shame and guilt about not being a productive member of society. The depressed person may become a nobody when his disability makes him unable to work or to earn a living. How then does an individual measure his self-worth when he or she is not working or producing? This is the question I asked myself as I struggled to come to terms with not living up to the expectations of my cultural programming. I was the firstborn son, raised in an upwardly mobile, middle-class Jewish community, where competition for entrance into Ivy League schools began in the 3rd grade. Unlike my Catholic friends who attended a nearby parochial school and were taught to avoid the 7 deadly sins, I learned that there was only one deadly sin: not living up to one's potential. This potential, of course, was very specifically defined. Unless you became a doctor, a lawyer, or ran your father's business, you were considered a failure. There were, of course, exceptions. One could always teach at Harvard, make a fortune on Wall Street, or win the Nobel Prize. As long as the gods of status and recognition were served, our parents and teachers would be happy. Such pressure to produce necessarily takes its toll. I distinctly recall my sadness when in the middle of my junior year in high school, a good friend of mine suddenly stopped coming to class. Rumor had it that he had suffered a nervous breakdown and was whisked away to a special school in Connecticut. Understanding that other promising minds had likewise succumbed to mental illness was my only consolation as I filed for Social Security disability benefits at the age of 48. While many of my classmates lived in $500,000 homes and earned six-figure incomes. Lacking money, power, and prestige, the standards by which I was raised to judge myself, my sense of failure and inadequacy continued to plague me. One day, I was invited to a potluck dinner where I met an attractive woman who had just been hired as a professor at the prestigious Reed College after having obtained her PhD from Harvard. After describing her exploits in great detail, she asked the dreaded question, "And what do you do for a living?" I paused for a moment to contemplate my response. Recalling my father's injunction to always tell the truth, I responded, "I attend day treatment and collect disability income." The woman looked at me with a mixture of bemusement and pity before making a discreet exit. I felt as if someone had placed a name tag on my shirt, the kind you get when you attend a singles group or a self-help seminar, that read, "Worthless." This interaction, or lack of it, hammered home the question: what happened to a person's self-esteem when a lifelong emotional disability such as clinical depression interferes with their ability to be productive in societal terms? Like the former athlete who was confined to a wheelchair after a paralyzing accident, I had to accept my limitations and find a new way to define my existence. I knew from my spiritual studies that a human being's essential worth and goodness comes from who he is, not from what he does. I understood that friends and family were working overtime to keep me alive, not because of my degrees or my bank account, but because they loved me. Moreover, I began to see that being disabled by depression created a valuable teaching. Like the fallen hero in Bob Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone, being stripped of my privilege dissolved my arrogance and made me a more humble and compassionate human being. Still, given my programming, it was an ongoing struggle to validate myself in the absence of external achievements. Then, one day, one of the group members who knew of my struggle said, "Douglas, who you are is not a function of how much money you make. Douglas, who you are is not a function of how many credentials you have. Douglas, who you are is not a function of your vocational identity or occupational title." My therapist, Pat, commented, "Sam has done a good job of defining who you are not. Can you find a positive way to describe who you are?" At that moment, I blurted out, "Who I am is a spiritual being who is on this earth to grow in love and wisdom." From then on, I strove to redefine my identity in non-achievement terms. For example, one day I noticed that I said a few kind words to a fellow patient at day treatment. Instead of taking that act for granted, as I usually might, I focused on it and valued it. Rather than dismissing it as a minor event, compared to doing something really great, I saw it as important. Pat supported this attitudinal shift. Your brother may be working on the 66th floor of an office building in Manhattan, but your work, right now, is to heal from this illness. A much harder job than being a vice president of Citibank. How do you figure that? I asked. Just managing to stay functional, given your level of pain, is a major achievement. I'm sorry that no one is giving you stock options for your display of courage. But the absence of financial reward does not invalidate the important work you are doing. Over the next few months, I struggled to release the toxic feelings of blame, guilt, or shame that so often accompany the stigma of mental illness. Rather than judging myself as weak or defective, I strove to love myself and to affirm my strength and goodness. Such healing does not occur overnight. The roots of shame-based conditioning and society's prejudice against the mentally ill run strong and deep. But my progress, while slow and sometimes painful, is steady. Ultimately, I am learning to let go of what Pat called the weapon of comparison, and to see my essential goodness is dependent not on what I do, but on who I am, a spiritual being who's on this earth to grow in love and wisdom.
This is Douglas Bloch. I hope you enjoyed listening to this part of my book. If you did so, please give the video a like. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments section, or you can email me, douglasbloch@gmail.com. If you'd like to subscribe to this channel, just click on my photo in the closing credits. You'll be taken to my subscribe page, where you can click on the subscribe button, and if you click on the bell up to the right or next to it, you'll be notified every time I make a new video or do a live chat. And until we meet again, I wish you the best in your mental health recovery. Thank you.